Well, thank you guys for joining us. I know you've all flown in from basically China, so feeling fresh as a daisy, no doubt. So, I think just maybe I can take a quick poll of the audience. How many people are familiar with the history of Bitcoin in China, and in particular some of the regulatory changes and so forth? If you could raise your hand. Okay, so maybe half the audience. So maybe what might be just useful would be to just sort of kind of talk a little bit bring everybody up to speed and level set. Maybe Jack, do you want to just talk a little bit about kind of when there started to be real kind of consumer interest in Bitcoin in China, and what you saw as the impact of that, and just talk about the time periods, and maybe a little bit about how that also impacted the broader Bitcoin market.
Sure, and I'm sure Bobby and Ray have a lot of insight into this too. I think interest really started about first half of 2013 when the price started moving. There was a big ramp up to 200 plus. At that point, interest had started to grow, and I think a bunch of exchanges came online in those few months. Then come November, when the price really ramped, China was sort of the leader in the price growth. But soon after that, December 5th, sort of the day that China came out with its official
let's leave off. We'll cover the regulatory stuff later. I just want to sort of help people understand what is the sort of organic consumer interest in Bitcoin in China. What is it about Bitcoin? What are the use cases that was driving the interest, and what is it that was peculiar about the Chinese environment there that stoked that?
Well, there's a lot of anecdotal stories about why people are interested. I went to a lot of meetups where people, still learning about what Bitcoin was, and I think that's still actually a process that's going on today. And fundamentally, though, they see it as an investment vehicle, a different asset class in which they can put their money.
And would you characterize it as a speculation vehicle or as a hedge against the fiat?
Totally speculation. People have said that people have told me, some people in the industry, where someone would come to an exchange and say, I want to buy some Bitcoins. I hear the price will double every couple of days. So here's some cash. Where can I get some?
Right. So it was largely driven by speculation.
Yeah.
And Bobby, I think you've got some good data about during that big run up in price that really leads you to believe that it was the Chinese demand that was pulling the price up across the world.
Yeah. Before we get to that, I want to just add a little bit more about the history. So the China Bitcoin scene started probably at the roots in mid-2011 when BTC China first launched over 3 years ago. At that time, it was just a small community of people who were interested in Bitcoin just because of the phenomenon. Very, very few people, and it was about the mining aspect. People are mining it, people want to buy it, people want to sell it. So the earliest communities were about these really early adopters. They were looking for an exchange aside from Mt. Gox, which was hard to access from China due to the fact that it was a foreign and all the money banking stuff was detached from China. So that's how BTC China got its roots. It was just that community. And then it wasn't until 2013 did it become more of the investment sort of speculation kind of vehicle. So 2013, with the run up in price, a lot of new players came on board, and they were saying, oh, wow, this is just another asset class we could invest in, make money by the run up in price. Yeah.
And I think you said that the peak Bitcoin price that people talk about, on Gox is actually lower than the actual peak price.
Yeah. So on the Gox, it was I think the April run up was about $265 around there. In China, it ran up to close to $300 equivalent. But there's a few ways to look at it. One way to look at it is there's more interest, more demand on the buy side in China. The other way to look at it is probably the liquidity was less than on Mt. Gox. So yeah.
And at that time, people were talking about some pretty positive signals out of the U.S., out of the Chinese government, that led people to think that actually the Chinese government might have a benevolent attitude towards Bitcoin. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. So in May of 2013, that's when the media started covering Bitcoin. There was a famous CCTV special about Bitcoin. at the time, people thought, oh, if CCTV covered about Bitcoin, it must be endorsed by the central party government.
And CCTV is
the central China television.
It's the state.
It's the state television
broadcasting company.
Yeah, and people thought, wow, if the state gives its blessing, then it's free for all. Let's all get into Bitcoin. But in hindsight, that was a little naive. I think the TV producers just did that special without getting blessing or directive from the central government.
And then, walk us through the various stages of the Chinese government's, increasing control over Bitcoin in China.
From what I saw, from what we understand, is the government didn't pay attention to Bitcoin. They got the upper echelon of the government, they get these daily briefings. Bitcoin was mentioned throughout the summer of 2013 in their briefings, but they didn't react to it. It wasn't until November, after that massive spike, there was a massive spike, a one-day spike on November 17th, 18th, 19th. It coincided actually with our announcement of the VC funding from Lightspeed. Overnight, it doubled in price in China time. It went from, I think, 3,000 renminbi, about $500, to about over $1,000 within 8-10 hours. The day after that, that's when a lot of people in the space got nervous because the buy side was clearly in China on that day, and that's when the subsequent sort of report on Bitcoin, when it went up to the upper echelons of government, that's when the guy on top decided to comment on it and said, let's do something about this. And that led to the series of actions within 2 weeks, led to the December 5th memo from the PBOC.
So maybe you could just sort of talk about what the memo said and then both officially and then the unofficial impact of the memo.
Yeah, so the memo was done hastily. Again, this is the state council level. They said, do something about this. We don't want this to be another bubble where Chinese people get hurt by this foreign, Bitcoin digital currency thing. So the intent was to, clamp it down a little bit and not let the bubble burst and go out of control.
So this is an important understanding that the intent of the government was consumer financial protection.
Yes.
It was not a concern about money laundering. It was not a concern about terrorist financing. These are the things that we hear in the West.
Correct.
It was actually driven by consumer financial protection concerns.
Correct. Yes.
It's a really interesting insight into the way the Chinese were thinking about it, which is very different from the way that I think you're hearing Western governments talk about their regulatory concerns.
Yeah. In China, the terrorist financing, the money laundering is not as much of a hot button. So the State Council then appointed the PBOC to lead the effort in conjunction with 4 other ministries. So they say, you go take it, you lead it, get these other 4 guys to play with you to do something jointly.
And the PBOC is essentially the Federal Reserve of...
Yeah, with the central bank for China, that's right. People's Bank of China. And the memo essentially, I'm sure you guys all know it by now. It's been in the news for so much. Essentially, Bitcoin is not a currency. The funny thing is, a few weeks before that memo, some of the officials came out to say Bitcoin is just a virtual commodity. People should be free to trade it. So having said that, they cannot go back and sort of take an opposite stance that Bitcoin is illegal. So the memo said Bitcoin is not a currency, it's a digital asset, commodity. People have the right to buy, sell, trade it. And that's the essence of the writing. It did talk about, whether banks and financial institutions can deal with it. They said banks and financial institutions cannot, touch Bitcoin. They left room for the directly and indirectly part. So it's similar to, it's a precursor to what the European banking, how last Friday they just announced similar ruling. So it was a precursor to that, yeah.
And that was the first official stance, but then subsequent to that, there was informal guidance that was also given to banks that had further negative impacts on the ability for Chinese people to trade Bitcoin.
So subsequently, the formal writing guidance on December 5th was written in really broad strokes, very broad coverage, and it allowed for interpretation adjustments, if you will. So the price came down a little bit on December 5th, it rebounded, and then the powers that be decided that it wasn't enough. So they actually went a step further to suppress the payment service providers from interacting with Bitcoin exchanges. So that was done in a verbal conversation, a verbal sort of requirement, and not a written law.
And the impact of that was that it prevented Chinese individuals from essentially wiring money to an exchange, and thereby cutting off a lot of the potential demand for Bitcoin. Because if you can't get your money in, how can you buy Bitcoin?
So it was an effective way, That was the December 16th, December 18th timeframe.
Right. And so since then, Ru, do you want to comment about kind of what the impact has been on the Chinese Bitcoin market, in particular, kind of the exchanges and wallets piece, and then where the interest in Bitcoin has moved to since then within the Chinese Bitcoin entrepreneurial community?
Right. Oh, yeah. So I would say because all the three largest exchanges in China, BTC China included, are all funded by well-capitalized VC firms, I'd say there's very little interest from the startup community to replicate another, fiat to Bitcoin exchange. Most of the projects I've seen have really been focused on, things that don't touch fiat. So for example, altcoin exchanges or altcoin wallets. Not many of those have come online. I feel like the development speed is a little bit slower than what I was expecting. And then one thing I was talking to you right before we got on stage was there's actually been a lot of capital being poured into mining operations. And so in preparation for this panel, I actually talked to a lot of the people that I knew were more involved with that aspect, because that's not really like a venture fundable business, so I don't look at it as consistently. But for information gathering, I talked to some of the people involved in mining, and it appears there's been like a staggering amount of money being poured in. So something like, the last two projects, one of the guys who I was talking to has been working on, the investment amounts were 5 million and 15 million. With one of the projects, the cumulative amount was going to be 60 million, and all in USD. So a lot of money being poured into mining operations, and not actually because China has, I was under the impression it had cheaper electricity, but that was actually not the case. It's because of cheaper labor and maintenance and real estate costs. And what's really interesting is that, in China, people are very opportunistic, so it's a little bit of a mix, what people consider like startups. So a lot of the startups that opportunities or business opportunities people see in Bitcoin there are less, more tech focused. So two of the things that I thought were interesting, I'll go into really briefly. One of them is a new crowdfunding website that's launched by not BTC China, but China BTC. And they're basically asking Bitcoin holders to lend Bitcoin to the miners for interest. So that's because a lot of the Bitcoin holders, they're all hoarders. They're not going to be selling, but they want to earn a return. And they also don't want to contribute to short sellers or other speculators. So they're happy to lend it to miners, but not other people. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then there are people doing sort of services around this whole investment. There's a guy who set up basically a consultancy that bridges the investors in the mining operations and the miners. And so he does like this professionalized due diligence, including auditing the books, like taking photos of the operations, and basically those are parts of the ecosystem where I see a lot more capital flow instead of what we see in the West. That's more application based.
Yeah, I want to add to that. It is interesting. In the Western world, we don't see as much people trying to use Bitcoin as a vehicle for investment. Whereas in China, I think it's due to the lack of other investment choices. People really see it like, I want to just make every small difference in terms of trying to get additional interest income on their deposits, whether in fiat or in Bitcoin. So I think that's uniquely Chinese.
I think the thing that I really want to kind of emphasize about this is that because most of the people in the room come from a sort of a Western perspective on Bitcoin, whether it's European or English or American. The set of assumptions that we have about what governments care about what the incentives of consumers are, can be dramatically different. And in fact, as you can see, are dramatically different in China, and that's creating different opportunities for companies, different opportunities, different reactions from the governments, and I think we're going to see equally even more different perspectives from various parts of the developing world. And so it's an important reminder that we can't assume that the motivations of the government, of other consumers and so forth in other parts of the world will be the same as they are in our home countries, because Bitcoin is obviously a global phenomenon. So Jack, one of the things that you mentioned to me is that because we've been seeing a different set of operating assumptions, different business models have arisen for Chinese Bitcoin companies than what we've been seeing in the West. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think there's a few reasons for underlying this. Well, one is the regulatory uncertainty. So going back to a bit about the regulation, there was a lot of debate about whether or not the classification of Bitcoin not being a currency made it legal to purchase goods with Bitcoin. There was a lot of people who speculated that you couldn't price things in Bitcoin. But the counter argument being, well, if Bitcoin was eggs and you can barter, why couldn't you do that with a virtual commodity? Whereas I think over time, I think that concern has died down and it's been replaced with, it's still tough to do merchant services for the reason that merchants still, a lot of them are under the assumption that Bitcoin is illegal. It was, when we did a wallet, we had merchant services. We could, we allowed merchants to accept Bitcoin for payment. But it was tough convincing them to take that risk, and especially combined with the propensity of Chinese consumers not to spend their Bitcoins. So that cuts off the merchant services portion of that. And so the other part of it is Chinese consumers are usually not very willing to pay for software. And competition being as fierce as it is, BTC China, OKCoin, Huobi, the biggest exchanges in China, having no transaction fees, they have to look for other ways to make money. And so we see exchanges doing things like lending services where they allow either the users or the platform itself will lend money to margin traders for interest. And that satisfies the user's desire to get interest on their Bitcoin deposits. And also I think some exchanges are looking into other projects like media or education to try to get advertising dollars around some of the traffic that flows in. So they have to be more creative as far as how to make money.
Bobby, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so in terms of the payment merchant services, what's interesting is China actually has a very advanced society in terms of online payments, the PayPal equivalents, the Alipay, Tencent, Tenpay. So unlike in the Western world where credit cards, I think in Europe as well, credit card fees are high, like Visa, MasterCard, American Express is notorious for charging 1%, 2%, or 3% on transactions. In China, that's not the case. In China, the predominant form of payment is through Alipay, it's sort of PayPal equivalent, very low fees, sub 1%, sub 0.5%. And then also the China UnionPay, which is a debit card system, which is also very low fees, less than the Visa, MasterCard networks. So in that sense, Bitcoin might have a tougher competition on the payment side, which also explains why merchant payments has not picked up on Bitcoin in China. So what we see globally is that Bitcoin is adopted globally in different countries, different regions for different reasons. Whether it's Argentina, Europe, North America, Asia, I think Bitcoin has been getting adoption around the world. And in China, it'll be a different flavor as well.
Again, I think it's just super instructive to hear that, a lot of the assumptions that we carry from, operating, doing business in the US or in the UK or Europe just don't apply in other parts of the world. And I think the ongoing assumption for a lot of us has been that the killer app for Bitcoin has been the free-ish transaction costs, and that is actually a much bigger deal when you're used to 3% transaction fees relative to sub 1% transaction fees for a digital transaction, an electronic transaction, if those alternatives are already widespread as they are in China with Alipay and Unipay. So I think, where does that leave the opportunities then in China for Bitcoin companies? Actually, before we go to there, I have one more question. So the fact that transaction fees for exchanges were mostly zero, there were periods when people were charging for them, but they've mostly been zero. How has that changed the behavior of the exchange traders, or how did that change the behavior of exchange traders? And we saw much bigger volumes reported on the Chinese exchanges relative to Bitstamp or BTCE or Gox when it was still relevant. How much of that is because transaction fees were zero? How much of that was for other reasons? Does anyone have any commentary on that?
So it's changed the game in terms of the trading volumes and all that. Without transaction fees, it's frictionless for people to buy and sell. It's also, so a lot of volatility. And actually volatility, it's good for some people, not good for others, right? It's good for people who want to trade and sort of make a profit, speculators. So they would try to move the price up and down. So there's a lot of accusations about manipulators, market manipulators, trying to squeeze the market in one direction and cash out. So there's a lot of that. Free zero commission trading also allows the exchanges to manipulate some of the trading volume. So there's been widespread case of that. I think if you're in China, all the exchange operators, we all know it. It's just way of life that the volumes are just inflated, and there's not much you can do about that. Because with zero fees, the exchange itself can make a bunch of transactions that show up as volume but are not actually. Yeah, there's two. Yeah, I've said that in the past. There's two ways. There's exchanges that just artificially report a higher number. I mean, these are all self-reported, so that's some of the challenges of an unregulated industry. And then, if you're just selling, if you're recording 100 Bitcoins being sold at this price, how do you know it was two different parties and not the same party? There's very little transparency in that. So, but it is what it is. It's a very competitive market in China, and it's certainly different than the exchanges in the rest of the world. So, Rory, what do you think the rest of the world can learn from what's happened in China so far?
What the rest of the world can learn? I was actually going to can I add to the last question instead? I was going to say that at least now when I talk to entrepreneurs in China, I feel like it's very different from last fall when the environment was very bullish and people thought they could make a product that would just survive solely on China. Nowadays, it's very different. It's very much, I need a global product. One of the things I care about is, what is the user growth in China of Bitcoin users. And, I don't have a current investment in any of the exchanges, so I don't have any insider information. But most of the people I talk to tend to think that it's really flat, or some actually believe the users are decreasing because of a lot of the difficulties in getting Bitcoin, and also there hasn't been crazy ramp-ups in price, so the interest has died down as a speculative asset. And it seems that there's less than 500,000 users in China, and if the growth is stagnant, then there's a very limited market opportunity for any business that's only centered in China. So I would actually say, so if I want to go into your question, what can the rest of the world learn from China? Well, I think that Chinese entrepreneurs, if there are going to be successful startups coming out of China, they're going to be actually forced to innovate on business model because of the fact that the native environment, the domestic environment is so tough. So I don't know what it is yet. I haven't seen anything, that's super interesting, but whatever is going to come out next, that's that people here will hear of is going to be definitely global in nature, and it's going to be different from what we've seen.
Jack, are you thinking about things in the same way? Are your businesses going to be targeting outside China?
I think that's one approach. Is, you know, there are a lot of very talented Bitcoin entrepreneurs and technologists in China. So, you know, on my team there are a few as well, and you know, I think the goal for these guys would have to be, you know, let's target a broader market, and if they can have an international team that ties in the China market with the rest of it, you know, I think there is an opportunity, and also too. You know, there's, like Ray touched on before, there's a lot of investment going into mining, and by some miners' calculations, you know, they're going to invest even more in the coming years. Some said, you know, 40 to 50, maybe 60% of mining power might come out of China. So in that respect, you know, I think it really behooves the Bitcoin community internationally to, you know, connect with Chinese Bitcoin miners and the community. If they're going to have that much control over network security, then, you know, I think those connections need to be built. But you know, even if they just remain in the mining sphere, that in itself means that, you know, China will remain a big player in the Bitcoin space.
Yeah, I was going to add, in terms of what can the rest of the world learn from Bitcoin or in China, it's probably on the regulation side. This is no joke, but I've said this before. It's what China has done on the regulation side. I think you'll see other countries try to copy. It's sort of like the say one thing and then do other approach, right? We've seen that in China. They say one thing, Bitcoin is legal, you know, people can freely trade, exchanges are okay. And then what they do then is they do something different, which is suffocate exchanges by limiting what banks and payment services do. So I found this to be true in Hong Kong as well. And is also true in Singapore. So the governments openly, nicely say, oh, Bitcoin, it's okay, we're not going to regulate Bitcoin. And then when the doors close, they tell all the banks, don't you dare touch it. Don't you dare transact with any Bitcoin companies. You're not allowed to do this. But it's all hush-hush, never, you know, written. So we've seen that in Hong Kong, Singapore, now we're seeing in Europe. So last Friday, the European, I forgot, was it Authority Banking, whatever, they just came out with the same sort of a guidance. Banks are not allowed to touch it until a later date. And that's the fear, that's my personal fear, that if the rest of the world adopts this attitude, then Bitcoin will have a more challenging time this year and next year. So hopefully we'll see some breakthroughs in regulatory around the world. But what's happened in China on the regulatory front is sort of glass half full, half empty. Because, you know, that's the bad side. But the positive side is, they have said Bitcoin is legitimate personal property, virtual commodity. So that means there's hope that one day the clouds will clear, the skies will clear, and Bitcoin will be allowed to function more as an equal peer in society.
You know? So you're saying, watch out, you don't get grin fucked by your regulators. And this is absolutely something that's happened, you know, in the past. You know, in the U.S., not in Bitcoin, but in a related financial services area around high interest rate lending. The regulators have, you know, in particular, it gets a little esoteric, but there's a bunch of high interest rate lenders similar to a Wonga that operate through a regulatory regime that basically allows Native American tribes to export higher interest rates than a bank would be able to. And that's all legal, but the government finds other ways to put pressure, and they do it by these sort of choke points, which is how do you get money in, how do you get money out. So even if it's legal to do what you're doing, they can still put pressure around the edges and really kind of hamper your business. So I think that's a really important point. It certainly has precedent.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'd like to open it up at this point to questions from the audience. Do we have microphones for people to ask questions with? Maybe let's start over there. Could you, okay, you're next.
Thank you.
Could you announce your name, your company, and then direct your question to one person?
Absolutely. My name is Ira Miller. I'm the CEO of Coinapulse, and I have a question for Bobby. You were talking about Bitcoin network competition, payment network competition in China, Alipay, and the very low fees. Clearly, there's a lot of fat that can be cut out of traditional payment networks around the world. If Alipay can have a fee of less than 1%, PayPal can, Visa can, everyone could do it. Do you think that Bitcoin could move the traditional payment networks to lower fees around the world? And if that happens, will it see a stagnation in the rest of the world, as it perhaps is seen in China?
Will who see a stagnation? Will
Bitcoin usage, the adoption of Bitcoin and interest in Bitcoin due to perhaps partially fees?
I'm not sure I understand the second part, but the first part of the question is, I think Bitcoin as payment will take off in societies and regions where the competition, where it's easy killing, where it's low-hanging fruit. So in areas where you're competing against credit card that has its problems with fraud and also with high fees, Bitcoin will succeed in those countries and locales. So I think that's for sure. I think it might take a few years, but we're already seeing adoption of merchant payment services around the rest of the world. Does that answer the first part of the question? Yeah, and the second part is about?
The second part is about if that happens and the fees shrink, will it decrease interest in Bitcoin?
Oh, you mean if Bitcoin succeeds in taking over as payment in lowering fees around the world, will then Bitcoin take a back seat? I wouldn't call that a backseat at all. I think the rest of the world.
I call that victory.
Yeah, that's like success, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to add to Bobby's point. I think that there's two opportunities. The first one is where you've got credit cards with 3% as a high ceiling. The other one is where you don't actually have good digital payment mechanisms at all, and where the ability to remotely pay for something. Like if you believe that there'll be more smartphones in the world in the future, if you believe there's going to be more e-commerce in the world in the future, then you're going to believe that there's going to be more remote transactions happening in the future. And those things need to have an ability for remote payment. And in large parts of the developing world, you don't have an incumbent like Alipay that already exists. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the mechanism for remote digital payment? Is Bitcoin going to be the answer to that? It's certainly a very good candidate for it. So, there was a question in the back there.
Hi, Arthur Hayes, CEO of BitMEX. Where do you see Hong Kong fitting in with the China regulatory picture of the PBOC, given that Hong Kong is usually the release valve for any Chinese regulation?
Who should go?
Who do you want to answer?
I'll take a stab at it. Hong Kong is no easier, I tell you. I met with I can't tell you who, but I met with people in the Hong Kong HK Monetary Authority, their version of the central bank. And they're very cordial. They're like, oh, Bitcoin is great. We're not going to touch it. It's not under regulatory purview. But then, like I told you, they've told all the banks, all the money changers, all the pawn shops, don't touch Bitcoin. So it's there's a rumor, or there's this feeling that China is going to allow Hong Kong to sort of experiment with Bitcoin and sort of close off Bitcoin in mainland China. I don't think there's any truth to that. I think that's just wild speculation by media, by eager media. I don't see any evidence of that. All the banks I talked to in Hong Kong, they're even more paranoid, because Hong Kong actually has US banking jurisdiction oversight, dealing with US dollars, FACTA, and all the, what's the other term? BSA, Bank Secrecy Act. So the banks in Hong Kong are actually under dual mandate from the PBOC and also from the US side. So it's even more strict, I would say. You guys want to, yeah.
Over there.
Hi. I am Tony Lane Casserly. I'm the CMO at ChangeTip, and we're in the micropayment space. What I'm primarily interested in is, I know Bill Gates and Warren Buffett actually went to China to talk to all of these new billionaires about philanthropy. And I'm wondering if psychologically, because there's this huge perception about the illegality of Bitcoin, if the right entry point into the market, especially based on the low fees that the credit cards are charging, isn't with microtransactions in the field of philanthropy, to actually encourage community growth through helping those who need it the most, building a positive perception and then scaling from there.
I'll take it. ChangeTip is a 500 company. But anyways, I would say that as you have to have a lot more pieces of infrastructure in place for people to trust it. But yes, like philanthropy would not be a bad idea to start pushing, I guess, the cause of Bitcoin. But there has been a lot of, not a lot, but there's been some major scandals in philanthropy, most notably involving the Red Cross in China in the past 2 years. So there's just a low level of trust from the general population. Perhaps by using, blockchain and making things more transparent, you could actually get around that. So yeah, maybe that's a good idea, and you guys should consider that.
Okay, I think maybe we can take 2 more questions. So we'll do one here and then one here.
Stand up
in the front.
Hello, I'm Fatih from Turkey. I'm interested to know about the merchant adoption in China. I mean, we all have heard about the trader speculation and the mining, but what about the merchant adoption side?
There isn't much. Yeah, I've talked to a few merchants, and part of it is what Bobby said. Existing payment protocols work well. The other is the perception of illegality. There have been a handful of people who've tried to make something like a BitPay for China, but last I heard, researched it, they've all pivoted into something else. Okay. The market's just not big enough. No.
Yeah. And it's actually, it's illegal, or
perceived to be.
If it's e-commerce that you're doing, and you use a third-party payment system, you actually can't, right? So if you're a vendor, for example, on China's version of eBay, you actually can't say you accept Bitcoin.
I will say, at one point, Taobao, on Taobao, there were quite a few merchants who accepted Bitcoin, but then Taobao restricted them, and that's the biggest marketplace.
Okay, so we'll take one last question and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, my name is Yaron, I'm an investor. I'm wondering, I don't want to sound too shady, but do the Chinese people have a limited ability to get out of Bitcoin right now? And if that's the case, does that mean that there's an arbitrage opportunity for someone walking around with a suitcase full of cash?
You're talking about money? You're talking about fiat currency, foreign currency controls?
Well, yes. Well, not only fiat currency, but current versus foreign, but just generally people wanting yuan for their Bitcoin or dollars or anything like that.
Should I give you the shady answer to your shady question?
Please.
So people assume, we all know that China has strict foreign currency controls in place. The limits are actually $50,000 US per person in or out, depending, there's some restrictions. And that's because China has managed currency, the renminbi. 2 things. One is, it turns out China is on track to liberalizing that and allowing for free floating currency. So that's already been in the plan and works. It might take a few years or 5-10 years. That's in the works. The other reality is these limits actually are not really, they're in place, but there are a lot of workarounds. A lot of workarounds. So there's shady people standing outside each bank where they will provide money changing services to you, in the shadow. And so there's plenty of workaround. So if you're a foreigner, if you're a Chinese citizen, you have more than $50,000 worth of money to exchange, or even less, they'll do it for you for really low cost. And these people are, technically it's not allowed, but there's no enforcement, so everyone knows about this. They stand right next to the bank security guard by the gate. Sometimes the teller, sometimes during lunch hour when it's really busy, the teller will tell you, if you want to change that, there's so much paperwork, don't bother, go to the guy right there, 3 feet away, he will give you cash for the US dollars and vice versa. So Bitcoin, it turns out, is not use case for using Bitcoin for transferring money into and out of China in terms of the foreign currency is actually not a big use case. That's the summary. Yeah. So Jack and Ray, do you agree with that?
Well, if you just had a bunch of Bitcoins and you want to turn them into RMB, it's actually not too hard. The hard part is getting money into exchanges, but it's pretty easy to get it out.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, guys.